a guy who was sentenced to 3 years in prison up to the Court of Appeal. And the Supreme Court found that this was a criminal case that has to do with somebody who operated or officiated at the, I believe, MPA. He served all of the 3 years in prison. And then the Supreme Court found that he was wrongly convicted. The only benefit he's got is that he cannot now be referred to as a convict. But he suffered the punishment for 3 years. In such cases, where the lower courts has misapplied the law, and a citizen has been sentenced to prison and served the whole of the 3 years, or even 5 years, is there a way in which the Supreme Court can order compensation for victims that suffer such humiliation for an act for which they were never guilty?
Distinguished Senator Adams Oshiomhole.
Oshiomhole. I represent the good people of Edo North from Edo State, where my Lord, the Acting Chief Judge, did our NYSC. Like everybody has said, sir, no one will look at this CV and want to ask questions. And I thought that for those who are in doubt, this training is not an act of favor or punishment. We just want to be enlightened as to have a window into the way in which the mind of the next Chief Justice of Nigeria works. So for Kalu, I needed to understand that we are not doing her any favor by saying, take a bow. In any case, that has been settled. I just want to ask 1 or 2 questions. You know, my Lord, when we complain of crowded court, the courts only adjudicate based on the judicial confined on it by Parliament. For example, when my case went to court as a governor or governorship dispute, the law then was that cases are terminated at the Court of Appeal. The National Assembly, in its wisdom, chose to remove that bar and say the cases must now terminate at the Supreme Court. So we can't overload a vehicle and then blame the driver for carrying overload. But there are a couple of issues that I believe many of us, distinguished senators, will be aware of. But depending on the party you belong, at the level of the state judiciaries, people tend to prefer, talking about forum shopping, to file cases before Federal High Court, particularly if it's a case in which you believe the state governor or the state government may have an interest. And how we deal with this, how the Chief Justice of the Federation can encourage judges in the states to show the same level of courage to pronounce where it's so discovered that a state government or a state interest, a state governor has crossed the red line. But people should feel able to go to a state high court and get justice, and not want to rush to federal high court because of the fear that judges, in many cases at the state level, don't want to enter judgment that will be offensive to the state executive. That is recently in the state, and for obvious reasons, I won't mention the state. The National Judicial Council approved the appointment of new judges, which is in line with the Constitution. But the state governor in Benin decided, I didn't mention him, I mentioned a city. The state governor in Benin refused to swear in. Excuse me.
You are protected. You did not mention the state. You only mentioned Benin.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Benin is not a state.
That's right. So, as we speak, those judges were not sworn in, even though they have been cleared by the National Judicial Council. When I was a governor, sir, there was a case, a judgment against the state government. But because the governor has immunity, the judge decided to convict the Attorney General for contempt of court. So I'm like, if a state governor disobey a ruling of a superior court, and because the governor has immunity, there is nothing you can do, I would have expected that the Attorney General would be charged for contempt of court or showing disrespect to the National Judicial Council, so that the discretion we exercise should not be abused to the extent that all of the processes that the National Judicial Council goes through to select and approve and forward to the governor for ratification. I am sure, Mr. President, you approve many such recommendations, not necessarily because you like the persons, but in the wisdom of the National Judicial Council, they've cleared them. So I thought that there might be, like to know whether a legislation is required or the Supreme Court, being a policy court, what it can do to help to curtail abuse of power at the level of the state. And lastly, there was this case of Mr. I don't know whether I should mention his name, a guy who was sentenced to 3 years in prison, up to the Court of Appeal. And the Supreme Court found that this was a criminal case that has to do with somebody who operated or officiated at the, I believe, MPA. He served all of the 3 years in prison. And then the Supreme Court found that he was wrongly convicted. The only benefit he's got is that he cannot now be referred to as a convict, but he suffered the punishment for 3 years. In such cases, where the lower court has misapplied the law, and a citizen has been sentenced to prison and served the whole of the 3 years, or even 5 years, is there a way in which the Supreme Court can order compensation for victims that suffer such humiliation for an act for which they were never guilty? And each time I see the guy on television, I wonder how he feels that he was in prison for 3 years, and the Supreme Court found that he was wrongly jailed, and yet he has suffered it and there are no compensation. I would have imagined that the court can award compensation, huge compensation, not the type that is not even enough to pay the cost of a senior advocate, but one that will also fairly compensate the victim for the period he spent in jail wrongly. Thank you, my Lord, and I also want to congratulate your family, because I've seen that you serve in virtually all the jurisdictions, north, south, east, west. That means that for most of the time, members of your family were alone. And so for you to accomplish this, I think members of your family deserve commendation as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
Oshiomhole, we have to return back to the serious business of screening and asking pertinent questions. You need to know that even outside this climb, the screening of this nature sometimes takes 42 days, 42 hours. In some jurisdictions, Chief Justice of Nigeria and even Justice of the Supreme Court designates are screened for up to 2 days. So, my Lord, it's not a waste of time. It is because Nigerians have a lot of questions that they want to ask, and they cannot ask those questions. We are their representatives. We are the ones that can ask. They want to hear from you as you are coming in, because after this, hardly will anybody see you, including my colleagues here. So this is the only time we can see you. So, and that's why almost everybody is struggling to ask one question or the other to hear your perspective to issues. And then we can now focus on the judiciary in the next 5 years.
Distinguished Senator Adams Oshiomhole from Edo North. You talked about the crowded courts dockets and the position where at a point in time matters terminated at the Court of Appeal, later on moved to the Supreme Court, and then the difference between cases filed at the Federal high courts and cases filed at the state high courts. What I would say is that it is the legislature that enacts the laws that confer jurisdiction on the courts. And therefore, anybody who has an option to go to either the federal high court or the state high court is entitled to utilize that option. At the same time, where cases are decided, where it appears that a certain side is favored, the appellate procedure is there. And I think that is the only way we can curb it, unless there is clear evidence of bias or any inducement, corruption, or anything like that. But other than that, whatever decisions are given, the option is to go on appeal. And if you can satisfy the appellate court or the Supreme Court that the court concerned was swayed by other considerations, then the court will give whatever judgment is applicable in the circumstances. Now, on the appointment of new judges, the situation where judges have been recommended for appointment and they have not been sworn in that instance, the National Judicial Council has made its position very clear, and it is the National Judicial Council that gives the directive for who should be appointed. And once that is done, there is nothing more for the National Judicial Council to do. It is to the detriment of any state concerned if it is now working with a lower number of judges, and you have capable and already confirmed judges that are not being able to carry out their duties. It is not a matter that the Supreme Court can intervene in unless a matter is brought to the Supreme Court on that issue. The issue of compensation for a person who has served his time and found to be not guilty, can the Supreme Court order compensation? The Supreme Court can only decide on matters that are specifically brought before it and grant reliefs. And where there is no legislation that gives the court that power or that authority, there's nothing the court can do. At best, the court can just make an obiter comment on it, that this is a situation where, in ordinary course of things, this person ought to be compensated. But it's not for the Supreme Court to unilaterally make such an order, because everything we do has to be based on the jurisdiction that is conferred on the court.